was the faculty advisor for Boise State's Turning Point USA chapter, and Charlie visited fairly regularly, meaning like once or twice over the course of my tenure there. And I considered him a friend. Still consider him a friend for those who believe in life after death. We always had conversations about areas where we disagreed. Now, Charlie Kirk is very religious. I am like aggressively agnostic. And so with those differing values, we would have arguments, pretty heated arguments about topics like abortion and the sanctity of life and what humanity means. And you might imagine how we might differ in those conversations, but riveting conversations. Neither of us tried to change each other's minds. It was always about trying to understand differing perspectives without having to agree with them. There's a lot that he disagrees with that he still entertains, ideas that he entertains. And I do agree with what Piers Morgan said about him being like the poster child of free speech. We do need more people like that.
Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
Welcome, everyone. I'm joined by Dr. Nafees Alam. Dr. Alam is a social worker, specifically in the world of sports social work. He is a professor and most recently writing about AI, which I'd love to get into with you today. But he joins us today with quite the resume. You know, when I was looking into your background, I went to various bios to kind of get a sense of what kind of work you've done. Every single bio I felt like had a little bit of something extra, specifically in the space of viewpoint diversity and issues related to ideological capture in social work, but broader culture. Can you give me a little bit of a sense of kind of what brought you into social work in the first place and what spurred your career?
Yeah, social work was plan Q. First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Looking forward to this. I came into social work as plan Q. It definitely wasn't plan A. Where plan A was football, that didn't work out. Plan B was Wall Street. That worked out for a little bit. And even getting into social work, it wasn't clinical practice, but nonprofit leadership. So I was finishing up my career in Wall Street, or maybe it was finishing me, I should say, because it was right around the time when like TD Ameritrade, E-Trade were coming up big.
Mhm.
And my job as a financial advisor was kind of being not automated like the AI sense, but automated in the sense of like people can just buy their own stocks from home. They don't need to call me to buy stocks and bonds for them and then, hold their accounts for them. They can hold their own accounts. So my position in Wall Street was becoming obsolete. And so I had the opportunity to take what I learned in essentially finance and bring it over to New York Foundling Hospital. I was only a social worker, direct practice for about a year or so before I started to take on leadership roles. And so, sports was always big growing up. And, I've worked with a lot of people from a mental health perspective when my sports stuff didn't work out. And so now I get to help others, inevitably when every sports career ends, whether it's because of retirement or injury or lack of skill, whatever it might be. So even in finance, I talk a lot about how social workers can prioritize their personal and professional growth, financial being included. So I think one of the reasons why I like, having as dense a bio as possible without it getting boring is that it gives the indication that you can do it all. Maybe not do the most, because obviously I wasn't the best football player. I wasn't the best financial analyst. I'm certainly not the best social worker, but employable, let's say, would be what I would call my roles. Touch above average, and I think that goes a long way. Being a master of essentially no trade, but really being a jack of all.
Well, if you ever write an autobiography, I do hope you'll call it Plan Q, because that's quite a resume and quite the Swiss Army knife of a career. I mean, you have had your foot in so many different spaces, and you've been able to see so many different worlds. Even just in a short span of talking to you the other day, I kind of got that sense where you were describing being a professor, but also, again, as I looked into things, I'm seeing you on, one podcast talking about your sports career. I'm seeing another podcast talk about social work. And it's made me very interested in terms of like, okay, so you got into the social work space, and you were bringing some of your expertise from kind of the finance world over. And then what kind of got you into the space of talking about things like viewpoint diversity and in academia? What kind of drew your attention there?
Yeah, I mean, my dad always told me to figure out where there's a need and then see if you're the one to fill that need. And so viewpoint diversity, it appeared to me to be a need that social work and mental health in general lacked. And so the story starts with my master's education. The first day, or the first week, I should say, of my master's education, I was asked to write a response paper to Macintosh's White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. For those who don't know, I'm sure you do, but those listeners and viewers who might not know, it's a 26 item list of white privilege. My response wasn't what professors were expecting from someone who is as brown as myself, and my response was that it's not white privilege; it's the color of your shirt, green privilege. It's socioeconomic status. When your parents are rich enough to buy a school, yeah, everybody knows your name, right? And so, if we're able to differentiate what is achieved due to skin color versus what is achieved due to socioeconomic status, I think we can better isolate what actually is racism. And that was my central point. F. The worst grade that I had ever
You got an
got.
F in the course.
Oh, not in the course. Just
Was that in the course or just on the assignment? Okay.
Just on the assignment. And I was allowed to redo it. And so I did redo the assignment. And this time, in the assignment itself, now English is my fourth language. So if it's some sort of like grammatical error, I could understand that. But there were no markups like, oh, you should have put a comma here, not a period, nothing like that. It was about, at the end of the paper, you didn't get the spirit of the assignment. And so I redid the assignment. I was allowed to. And in redoing it, I did it as a social experiment. I just disagreed with everything I agreed with and agreed with everything I disagreed with. And then I got an A, and they wanted to hang up my paper on the bulletin board. So I realized that I wasn't being graded on my ability to think for myself, but rather my ability to think in alignment with the thoughts of my professors. And that's what made me say to myself, I want to be a professor someday. I didn't realize it would be this quick, but someday I want to be a professor. Someday I want to have a voice in this space to create an environment where viewpoint diversity, and Martin Luther King, the color of one's skin should not be a proxy of one's character. And I operate from that perspective on a daily basis. Every speech that I give, every conversation that I have, like the conversation I'm having with you, the central point that I want to get across, assuming we're talking about this topic and not sports or like who's going to win the fight or something like that, assuming we're talking about something academic like this, the point that I want to come across is that someone's skin color, someone's gender, someone's sexuality does not indicate what they're thinking and how they're thinking. The color of one's skin, external demographics, do not indicate the content of one's character, internal demographics.
It's so interesting is that 15, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, I would say that was not a foreign assumption to most people who grew up in the West or just generally in the 21st century. They had a grasp of that message had been kind of taken in as truth. And then what I'm hearing you describe is you're in this class, generally speaking, of course, but you're in this class. And in order to pass the assignment, you're actually having to flip your paradigm around from that to something else where actually you're having to think in the world in terms that are the opposite to that, where it's, you brought up the socioeconomic advantages or disadvantages as a paradigm to look at it through, a lens to look at it through. But what they're asking you to do, and I'm very familiar with that piece, that was a piece I was exposed to in my diversity class. They're asking you to flip it all the way around and say, no, actually what's paramount is everything other than that right now. So long as we're talking about race, ethnicity, ability, status, gender, the usual things that they usually throw out there. In this one specific instance, though, Peggy McIntosh being unpacking the conceptual knapsack of white privilege, if I'm remembering the title correctly.
Yeah.
And it's like 24 to 26 items, something like that. You have to kind of
it's 20
hierarchically.
Back in 1970 something. Yep. Unpacking the invisible knapsack. That's what it is. Yeah.
And so you're conveying this message. What felt off to you about that fundamentally when they gave you that assignment the first time before you flipped it around? Like what was what felt like it was missing there?
Well, I thought this was an opportunity for me to show that I can think critically and say, yeah, this is what you've assigned me, but this is a different perspective than the perspective that I was told to have. And so I thought to myself, I always assume the best, maybe to a fault, but that's just how I operate. I thought to myself, oh, my professors are testing whether or not I have the ability to take what they've given me and look at it from a different angle. And that was my perspective going into it. It wasn't very intentional. I thought it was a very easy assignment, believe it or not. I was like, well, if this is what a master's assignment is, I'm going to get all A's. Didn't realize that my first assignment would be an F because I thought to myself, it's so easy to take every one of these 26 items, well, not everyone, 23 of those 26 items, and say socioeconomic status plays a bigger factor in that privilege than whiteness does. And I thought it was an easy assignment, only to realize that, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, no. I have to study the kind of way that I don't think for myself. And it was a good experience. Now, despite what this seems like, I had a wonderful I would not change my experience for anything. Because over the next 2 years, and then the beginning of my doctorate as well, I would cosplay as something that I'm not. Every article,
Mm,
I mean, not every paper that I would write, every time I would participate in class, I would essentially just blame white people, blame rich people,
mm,
and that's it.
mhm,
A. And so even though I didn't agree
mhm,
with the perspective, it gave me a lesson. It taught me a lesson that I could not have learned otherwise, which is to understand opposing viewpoints by cosplaying them. I
mm,
was precisely what my skin tone suggests that I should be. If I was wearing a short sleeve shirt, you see me, I'm covered in tattoos, not to get stereotypical, but I look like a certain kind of way that would vote a certain kind of way, that would think a certain kind of way. And people tend to be surprised when I think in a different sort of way. And so I played into that.
mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, they tend to be surprised when there's more to you than what's on the surface.
Yeah.
And that's what is so uh I think what gives people pause when it comes to these ideas, particularly if they're outside of academia. What I've noticed is they're like, you said what now? We're supposed to do what? We're supposed to kind of flip this idea. Now you said you were cosplaying
Mhm.
as what they wanted you to be.
Yeah.
And I've often wondered for people, because different people adapt to these circumstances using different like strategies and methods to get through it. I've often wondered that element of it, like what that's like for you internally, because I do see the possibility, not to kind of be to lead you here, but I see the possibility of that being extremely strenuous for somebody, particularly if it grates against their moral sensibilities in the first place. I mean, not to lead you somewhere, but what was it like to cosplay for those years?
Yeah, it wasn't stressful because I was more focused on the profession of social work than the
Mm,
education of social work. So, I mean, while I was getting my master's, I was working at New York Foundling Hospital in leadership positions. And so, the practice of social work was way less political and way less indoctrinating than the education of social work. And so when I went to school to get an education, um, it didn't feel as stressful because I knew at work I would be able to just be myself. Furthermore, it's not something where like I knew right then and there what I wanted to do. And so data collection
mm,
began right away. Like theoretically, data collection began right away. And I knew that this is what I wanted to do in the future. And so I didn't find it to be stressful in any sort of way because it gave me an opportunity that I would not have had. So I tried to make the most of it by thinking to myself, in no other situation would cosplaying as something that I am not be beneficial. Here is a wonderful opportunity for precisely that. And it'll only be for 2 years. And then a PhD was only for a couple of years for the before, I was told you could be yourself here. A PhD is about giving back to the growing body of knowledge,
mm,
right? So, I was a little bit apprehensive being myself, started my PhD, but it felt very welcome as someone with an Islamic last name and a Jewish university getting my PhD. Like that's where I found the greatest viewpoint diversity, believe it or not. But during those master's years, it was just 2 years of just cosplaying and data collection and knowing that this is going to be valuable someday. And here we are, about a little bit over a decade. Being able to speak on these topics, which I wouldn't be able to had I not had that, I guess, somewhat negative opportunity.
It almost sounds like what you're describing. It reminds me of method acting in a way, and
Yeah.
I think that's part of my preconception related to putting on kind of the garb of this ideology, let's say, in a sense, because a lot of people who seem to utilize method acting proper will report things like a changing in their psychology or kind of a change in their outlook or kind of even the way that they look at themselves. What was it like to be behind the veil in that way? Like, what did you discover, do you think, fundamentally?
I learned so much about what I do now, which is the point counterpoint approach and methodology.
Mm,
So prior to that experience, which I didn't want to have, prior to that experience, I would think of people who think differently from me as lacking something, which is human nature, right? You feel like you have the world figured out. What's the old saying? No one knows more than a teenager, right? So
mm.
that was the perspective. But cosplaying over 2 years, now 2 days is different. 2 days is just acting and you're done with it. But over 2 years, I had to research and figure out why people think the way that they do. And to this day, I'm still very close friends with people that I am diametrically opposed to, but I understand where they're coming from. So, for example, the whole racial thing, blaming everything on race, I never believed that. But now, with those 2 years of schooling and cosplaying as something that I'm not, I understand why someone would, because there is a historical, evidence of historical examples of severe racism. And to suggest that residue from those periods don't show up in 2025 and going into 2026 would be very immature and irresponsible as an academic. So there is a residue of that. And so is it a residue or is it the entire screen is the question. To assume that there is no residue is incorrect. For example, I'm being a little too abstract and theoretical. To assume that in 2025 racism doesn't exist in America is inaccurate. It's also inaccurate to suggest that racism defines every single person and every single thing. The truth is somewhere in between. And that's what it helped me learn. It's not my truth necessarily, where I thought that, well, if you have money, race doesn't matter. No, it does. I just don't know how much it does. And I might have a different opinion than you, but I'm able to understand why you might have a different opinion than myself.
And I think it's that nuanced approach that you've taken to it that really caught my attention because I think it can be really easy. Even when I was describing Martin Luther King's philosophy and saying that people have really taken that in the West, what I was saying was, generally speaking, we have perpetuated that narrative long enough that most people seem to act as if it's true. I don't know if they actually believe it on a moment to moment basis, but they seem to act out the proposition that that's true. And so I don't know what's going on internally for them.
Yeah.
I think is kind of the way to look at this. But as far as I can tell, most of the time, people seem to be trying to do their best when it comes to relationships just generally. And it seems that these ideas came in, like you were saying, they took up the whole gestalt, they took up the whole frame and said, no, this is essentially monochromatic, it's black and white. And we're going to take out all the color that's in the painting behind me, apparently. But there's so much more going on inside of people. And it does feel like this cultural anachronism to some degree
Mhm.
that has just, I often say, it takes the life out of living. It takes out the colorful play and says, nope, these are oppressor oppressee dynamics, nothing more.
There's comfort in simplification and
Mm,
efficiency because, just being able to recognize and live within nuance is in and of itself a privilege, isn't it?
mm,
I'm not saying that we're necessarily, you know, ultra rich, but, we have enough. We have jobs, we have, careers, not just jobs, we have careers, we have educations, we have support systems. And so with those privileges comes an opportunity for us, you and I, and perhaps many of our viewers and listeners, to live in this privileged life where we can sit back and think to ourselves, to be or not to be, this nuanced sort of way of living. We're failing to recognize that the majority of the world's population doesn't know when their next meal is going to come from. Not maybe not the majority, but a good chunk of the world's population doesn't know when their next meal is going to come from. I grew up in Bangladesh. I could look around. If you go there, people don't know if they're going to survive until tomorrow, and that is not hyperbole. That's real. And so, for those people, nuance is a joke. Nuance is something where, the rich people do, or the privileged class do. We don't have the privilege of thinking of life in the concept of nuance. And so in American culture, there is homelessness, but even if there's not, there is a survival instinct that is necessary for people who might not be socioeconomically privileged, who might not know if next month their SNAP coverage is going to lapse, and they don't know if they can feed themselves and their kids. If they're living in the projects, if they're living on social welfare, and they don't know if that social welfare is going to continue. How could we possibly ask them to think of life in this nuanced sort of way? I think that would certainly show our sense of privilege as well. And so I try to be careful as far as thinking about, like, yes, I think nuance is important. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But at the same time, the consideration of nuance itself indicates a level of privilege.
And that's always been, I think, a critique levied against what the ivory tower type dynamics, regardless of time period, is that somebody has time to actually think about how they think life functions versus living the moment to moment experience of trying to survive and thrive in their circumstances.
Yeah.
And when you really drew up that contrast when you said, when I got into the work, it was such a stark difference, the way I interpreted it, at least,
Yeah.
from what I was being told in the education sphere, where I'm being asked to cosplay, essentially, or what I've decided to as a point of an opportunity, turning kind of, lemons into lemonade here. And it's like, but when you're out working with people, and I agree wholeheartedly, if you're working in a community, particularly a lower socioeconomic status community, it is a different set of constraints that you're talking about.
Mhm.
As a therapist, we're not necessarily talking about the intrapsychic proper. Sometimes what's going on for those individuals, it's a natural and understandable reaction to their circumstances.
Yeah.
How do we get them what they need in order to make sure they can get through that becomes the question under those circumstances. A completely different setting
Yeah.
altogether.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that
Mm,
that once we were able to take that into account and understand, like, like knowing your audience, right?
mm,
Talking to someone who is struggling to survive about the intricacies of nuance, it's just not going to land. And just like, talking to many of us about things like, if Elon Musk were to come in and talk to me and you about, what 2035 looks like, we'll also be sort of lost. Like, what is he even talking about? Like, I'm thinking about,
mm,
this conversation right here. And so there's just levels to all of this. And
mm.
recognizing that is important, because even though we are all the same species as humans, our lived experiences are markedly different. And in my opinion, I'll die on this hill. Money is the difference maker. There's a huge difference between a billionaire and a millionaire. There's a huge difference between a millionaire and a thousandaire, or someone who's living in poverty. And so just the lived experiences that people have, and how much of those experiences are painted by socioeconomic status, is, in my opinion, what we need to address most and
Right.
first. Do we need to address racism? Do we need to address sexism? Yes, we do. But I think, and this is my hill, this is my platform that I tend to talk about often, is that if we address socioeconomic oppression, socioeconomic differences and privileges first, I think a fraction of racism goes away. I think a fraction of sexism goes away. Maybe not goes away, but is addressed, I should say. Because I wonder how much of racism is actually socioeconomic status. How much of
Mm.
sexism is actually socioeconomic status. So if we can address green privilege first, whatever remains of white privilege, whatever remains of male privilege, will be less so, because the socioeconomic factor, that variable, will not be factored in to those other privileges.
And that seems like it was a very acceptable viewpoint on the subject for as long as I can remember, at least. That is the rising tide raises all ships, reduces tension, and reduces chances for conflict kind of paradigm that it seems to be lost in the shuffle here with this kind of ideological intrusion that's taken place. Now, do you think social workers, I heard you make that contrast between being out in the field versus being in school. Do you think social work has lost that perspective, or is there more nuance here?
I think the field of social work hasn't lost that perspective because you've got plenty of authors, plenty of scholars who are writing on these topics, who have been writing on these topics for longer than I've been in my career. So the ivory tower acknowledges viewpoint diversity. I think the reason why it might not show up in social work practice so much is because of the fact that people are struggling to survive, and the concepts, the nuanced concepts, are not relevant to them at this point, at this time in the hierarchy of needs. Nuance is not where we're meeting the client, we're meeting them at basic needs. And so as a result, it tends to get overlooked. I think it's present. In fact, I know that it's present because we just presented a standing room only presentation at the Council on Social Work Education conference in October. We've talked a lot about heterodox social work and how big it's getting. So there's
Mm,
definitely a market for it. So, and the market didn't just appear because we appeared. Some of these articles go back
mhm,
to the early 2000s, before, I think, yeah, when I was doing my undergrad, even before I even knew that this was an area of
mm,
scholarship. So now they're starting to come up more, and those authors are certainly getting a lot of credit because they're being cited. So yeah, I think it's always been there. It has just been overlooked. And because it's been overlooked, people have thought social work to be more indoctrinating than it actually is.
mhm. It's interesting because I would say that was the experience in, at least in my experience in mental health. But when you go through, what I found was when you go through kind of the mill of ideas and you're being tested on whether or not you can reverse some of your preconceptions to something that doesn't feel right as far as how you've experienced the world,
Mhm.
it can feel as though going out in the field is still steeped in that. And I don't know if this was an observation of yours, but what I saw clinically, at least from early practitioners, so like student practitioners, quite often you'd have individuals who are still relaying the information or relaying the message of what's going on inside the institution while they're at their training sites, let's say, which
Mhm.
kind of carries it over into the clinical work. Now, how much of that shows up actually one on one with a therapist and a client, I don't know. I really I would have to be in the room to be able to speculate, but it is a tough thing to kind of to diffuse yourself from in a way where I was like, for myself, I'm speaking for myself and maybe some others that I've spoken with, that it creates this apparatus of you have to comply and do things in this way. When you're at your most vulnerable in your training, if we're talking about school, like when you're creating your professional identity, did you see colleagues bring that in at all over from the education sphere, or was it completely just different?
Well, some of them did because you want to apply what you've learned in school, but
Mm,
telling, learning that white privilege impacts every black and brown person in school is very different from telling black and brown people that white privilege is to blame for all of their struggles. So, what you
mhm,
learn in school versus what you see in practice, you learn real quick. Because, the first day on the field, let's say we'll have a new social worker, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, going out into the field, ready to teach, all the clients that they're working with that, everything that they're experiencing is the fault of white privilege. Now
mm.
what? you know? Now what? Because, like, he
Right.
goes,
Where do you go from
yeah,
there?
yeah, exactly. And so it only takes you so far. And then I think practitioners, the social work practice tends to humble social work scholars and social work
Mm,
students, once they get into practice and they realize that, social work education did prepare us to become social work practitioners, but not to the fullest extent. It prepared us to get into social work and start learning what we need to learn to be the best practitioners possible. But no education completely covers everything that you'll find in practice.
I'm forgetting who said it, but I never let my schooling get in the way of my education. But there seems to be something to that here, in that, like, once you're out there, you're really in the trenches. How is critical race theory? I remember asking in a trauma class once, if you don't mind me sharing a
Yeah,
little bit. I said, "How is this theory?" It's fine that you believe this, I guess. It's not. It's I don't know that I fully buy the way that you're putting this forth, but it's okay. How am I supposed to translate that to trauma work in a trauma informed care course when I have a mom who can't meet the bills?
yeah,
A mom who has a couple kids, and maybe they're also taking care of another family member's kids because that family member is in dire straits and also needs some assistance.
yeah.
How does this apply? Where does this go? And I don't think I've ever heard anyone give me a functional explanation of what you're supposed to do with those theories. Just not at all. I've read therapists try and describe it, but as far as I can tell, it looks like an example that always sticks with me is this Rogerian approach of, really getting this trust and rapport with the client, and then suddenly you smuggle it in. You embed this idea, and then it's like, well, then what? You make them a change agent and have them go do what exactly? It's never been clear to me.
I wonder how practitioners in any mental health field taking a strengths-based approach, how would they not put the onus of change upon the client themselves? So this way the client can start to feel like they can do something about their environment and their experience.
Mm.
Because if we're always blaming external variables and external factors, then there's nothing we can do about that. I can't change the way that you think, and you
Mhm.
can't change the way that I think. And so, if all we're going to do is blame everything outside, then life isn't going to get better. And so, you might have a client for life, but there will be no progress whatsoever. At some point, no matter what kind of mental health you practice in social work, psychology, whatever it is, psychiatry, it has to be this is what you can do. This is what we can do in a therapeutic setting, right? The world might be against us. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know what that perspective, that individual's perspective might be. But this is what we can do about it. And so if we blame everything on white privilege, if we use critical race theory to say that, well, you know what, you're black, you're brown, you'll never be anything. All right. Now what? So it
Now what? Where do we go?
yeah. And so I think it
Mhm.
organically goes from theory to practice. And as critical race theory shifts into critical race practice, it just doesn't hold up. Because from theory to
Mhm.
practice, if all you're doing in practice is blaming everything on some external variable or immutable characteristic, like race, then what progress can be made?
Fundamentally, it doesn't sound like much.
Yeah.
And again, I'm still waiting for a good argument as to what you do. I wanted to take a step back for a moment, though, because you said that when you went from your master's to your PhD, there was kind of a change of form. At what point did you find yourself kind of getting involved in more of the viewpoint diversity and heterodox spaces?
Well, it was during my PhD where I became more and more interested in it.
Hmm.
That's not what my dissertation was on. But it was something where I started to grow more and more interested in it because I could. And at that point, my master's was fresh in my mind. So I wanted to write as many of my notes down as possible, run them through some of the most wonderful, mentors that I could think of ever having. And they helped me sort of refine those ideas, and I was the graduation speaker at my PhD graduation. And that was the first speech that I'd ever given publicly on viewpoint diversity. So even in my CV, the first presentation that I have listed, which technically would be an academic presentation, is that presentation where I talked about the importance of viewpoint diversity in education. And yeah, that was the first.
At your graduation.
Yeah, yeah, after well, even during
Mm.
graduation, it was more like,
Mm.
in classes, and they knew what my graduation speech was going to be before I delivered it.
Mhm.
But, before that day, it was mostly just with my professors, with some other students. Now, this is something that I leaned into hard. As I mentioned, Islamic last name, Jewish university.
Mhm.
So I'm already in an environment where I might be seen as someone different, but I wanted to be there because of what I learned in my master's. I didn't know that I was going to go to yeshiva while I was getting my
Mhm.
master's, but I thought to myself, this has been such a wonderful experience. How can I magnify this. Well, I was born in Libya. My parents are Muslim. I am agnostic, but people might look at my last name and say, yeah, he's a practicing Muslim. How about I go to a Jewish university for my PhD and see how I'm perceived? Part to get a good education because yeshiva is an R1, a very strong program,
Mm-hmm.
but part to see how this would all work out. The most wonderful experience that I've had. It was the first time that I got an opportunity to teach some classes. Imagine that, right? Because we taught Israeli students as well. So here I am,
Mm-hmm.
a professor with an Islamic last name, teaching students from Israel who come to New York City for the summer, right? And it's just
Mm-hmm.
in a Jewish university. You talk about viewpoint
Mm-hmm.
diversity on a global scale. If you were to take a picture of that classroom, I would be so proud of what we achieved there. Because obviously there was that impression of like, Alam is going to be teaching us. And I didn't lean into the differences. I leaned into the similarities. Many of the jokes that we would make are very similar. Now, nothing off, nothing particularly dark or anything like that, because, more conservative environment, both in Muslim
Mm-hmm.
cultures and in Jewish cultures, but jokes about like uh, uh, confidence intervals or something silly that most people would think
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, you guys are dorks for making fun of that. But like we were able to laugh with one another. Islamic people, Jewish people laughing with one another in a Jewish university with the professor being an Islamic, having an Islamic last name, teaching Jewish students from Israel. That further validated the idea that I made the right choice in going to the school that I did and really leaning into this viewpoint diversity stuff. I can't stress enough that viewpoint diversity from an American perspective is limited because often we think of like, well, can Democrats and Republicans get along with one another? That's usually the go-to when it comes to viewpoint diversity. Maybe some people think of like, can white people and black people get along with one another? I'm like, there's more than just white and black people, but fine. But on a global perspective, there are Muslim people, there are Jewish people. Muslims and Hindus have butted heads a lot too, right? And so globally, I think viewpoint diversity, if we're at a position to be able to appreciate that nuance, can do wonders if we take it beyond just the Democrats and Republicans or the white people and black people and apply it globally. I think that would be a step, small one, a step toward world peace. Will we ever achieve it? I don't think so. But if that results in one less fatality somewhere across the world, I think it's worth doing.
Sounds like we might trend upward if we took that approach. And I don't just say that just to agree for the point of agreement. I think what you're pointing out is even to go into the liberal conservative paradigm is a us and them black and white paradigm that closes in on our thinking, where the tapestry of conservatives and the tapestry of liberals, so to speak, they don't hold consistent a set of values or beliefs among each, like as if it's homogenous. Once you're part of this group, once you identify with this group, you believe A through Z. And it's
Yeah.
like, no, people are playful, they're sophisticated, they change throughout their life. One week they feel this way and say this thing, but the next week they might actually do this thing that shows they believe this whole other thing. It's,
Yeah.
not to keep it hypothetical myself, but it's this seems like common sense in some ways, and yet it feels like it's been wrung out a little bit. It's like people morph and change and evolve. That's part of the fun.
Common sense has never been
Uncommon. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And so when you got involved with Heterodox Academy, tell me a little bit about that journey. How did you initially like find out about them? How did you initially get involved?
Heterodox Academy. I didn't even know about them until around 2021, 2022, when a colleague of mine, Matt Rekla, introduced me to Heterodox Academy when I was at Boise State University. And this was when I reached out to Matt Rekla to design my course titled Freedom of Thought. Compiling all of the things that I've learned into a special interest course. And Matt Rekla was the leader is still the lead of University Foundations. So he reviewing this course, we met a couple times to make sure that all of the standards were met. He recommended that I link up with Heterodox Academy, become a member, and learn as much as I could about them. And he's still very much involved with Heterodox Academy to this day. And so after getting involved with them, I feel like I found my intellectual home because they too understand the perspective that the most difficult thing to do is to be centrist and moderate, because much like a pendulum, the push and pull factors are the strongest when it's right in the middle. So it takes a lot of intention
Mm.
to say, I'm going to stay in the middle. Yes, you've made a good point, but I'm not going to go with you. Yes, this other person made a good point, but I'm not going to go with them. I'm going to stay neutral. I'm going to stay centrist. And that's the most, in a weird way, the most aggressive thing you can do is be centrist, because everything is trying to pull you, everything is trying to push you. So you have to aggressively stand your ground and say, no, I will not just rubber stamp my name next to this political party. I will not just rubber stamp my name to the idea that everything that I've experienced is due to my race, right? And I will also not rubber stamp my name to the idea that nothing that I've experienced is due to my race either. So being aggressively neutral is a perspective that I really value a lot. At Heterodox Academy, not speaking for them obviously, but I really found a home in Heterodox Academy because I was surrounded by scholars who think in that sort of point counterpoint way.
It's been a couple of years since I've engaged with the greater community at Heterodox, but it was a tapestry of viewpoints. It really was a practice what you preach kind of landscape. And what you're saying there, I think, is so poignant in that it takes more energy to stay in the center and try and be deliberate with the way that you're interpreting the world, as opposed to just kind of going with the momentum of that pendulum. I think I said to my colleagues here at CTA recently, it occurred to me that some people observe the pendulum and some people take the pendulum for a ride. And
Yeah,
that you could easily be the person who's like being taken by this energy, the spirit of the moment so easily. You can lose that center focus just with the right emotion and the right reasons at that time, but totally lose your balance
yeah,
entirely.
yeah, 100%.
Something I know we talked about kind of maybe getting into a little bit before we started recording was there was a picture that you had put up a couple months ago after the passing of Charlie Kirk.
Mhm.
And I saw the picture and it was you and him on stage. I do believe there was like a Turning Point USA
Yep,
backdrop.
yep.
And I was very curious about the relationship there and what you had to say on the subject.
Yeah, so I was the faculty advisor for Boise State's Turning Point USA chapter, and Charlie visited fairly regularly, meaning like once or twice over the course of my tenure there. And had a few conversations with him privately, a couple of meals with him privately as well. I considered him a friend. I don't know if you believe in the
Mm.
afterlife, and those who do, still consider him a friend. For those who believe in life after death, and what the reason why is because we always had conversations about areas where we disagreed. Now, Charlie Kirk is very religious, and I'm going to speak about him in the present tense, if that's okay. Charlie Kirk,
Sure.
Charlie Kirk is very religious. I am not. I am like aggressively agnostic. And so with those differing values, we would have arguments, pretty heated arguments about topics like abortion and the sanctity of life and what humanity means. Is it just flesh and bones and skin, or is there some sort of magic to us? And you might imagine how we might differ. Charlie and I might differ in those conversations, but riveting conversations. Neither of us tried to change each other's minds. It was always about trying to understand differing perspectives and a wonderful handshake. Once or twice, we would give each other a hug, usually just to, when we were done and he was going back home or something like that. But I don't know if he remembered me or something like that, because I'm sure, he would go on visits every week, it seemed like in some months. But I consider him a friend, um, because he is not the indoctrinating type. He
Mm.
respects differing viewpoints without having to agree with them. There's a lot that he disagrees with that he still entertains, ideas that he entertains. And I do agree with what Piers Morgan said about him being sort of like the poster child of free speech, because we do need more people like that. And so that picture It was after our Turning Point USA event. He was kind enough to give me a shout out in a huge crowd of saying that's a professor that really gets it and just like teaches in this sort of way after he and I had these conversations. And I just like I was so honored by that statement that he made.
Mm.
And it was a pretty crowded environment, and the conversations that we had, like I just remember, like there were a lot of things that we did agree on, because some of the topics, like for example, just for the sake of giving an example, we did agree on wealth distribution, for example.
Mhm.
And so, how often did we talk about wealth distribution? Once. That was about it. That was about it, because it was boring. Yeah, Charlie, I agree. Yeah, Nafees, I agree with you. All right, we're done. Now let's talk about areas that we don't agree on. Over dinner, over some wonderful meals and wonderful conversations. And I think, and to sort of like wrap this up, because I know I'm rambling a little bit, because I care for him. He's such a good person, in my opinion, and I just it still bothers me how many people have considered that event to be a good event for American and human history. And now, one of the difficult things that I did is that first, when it happened on a Wednesday. I took Thursday and Friday off. I called out sick. And then I went back on Monday, and I was surrounded by students, because this was when I posted that picture. I was surrounded by some students who
Mhm.
saw that post. I didn't know that they followed me, but I guess, there's no hiding. And some students were very happy. And here I am trying to hold back tears over the death of a friend. Public figure, yes. Friend first, as far as I'm concerned. Trying to hold back tears over the death of a friend. And I have to um, walk the walk. And what I mean by that is that if I'm going to teach in this point counterpoint kind of way, if I'm going to create an environment where disagreement is welcome, I could not shut down conversations from students who thought that Charlie Kirk's assassination was a good thing. And so it's probably the most difficult two classes that I have ever taught was where students would chime in, realizing that I'm his friend, and still saying this is why his assassination, in their opinion, was apparently a good thing. And I wasn't, and then of course there
Mm.
were students having conversations about this is the worst thing that could have possibly happened. And obviously you could tell where I stand. This is a friend of mine, obviously, right? And so separating
Sure.
myself in that kind of way, while it was emotionally difficult to do, it still is even emotionally difficult to even talk about and relive those two classes. Um, I think it really. I don't want to speak for him, obviously, because I don't. But I think Charlie would have been proud if he were to see those classes, because that's what he was about those differing viewpoints, even about his own life. How could you think that such a wonderful person should have been killed? In my opinion, a wonderful person should have been killed. Why? What makes him someone who's worthy of being assassinated? And some students had some strong opinions about that. And some colleagues did as well, but that's not what this conversation is about. A lot of my colleagues, when they saw that picture posted, like, why do you have that up there? And why does your post suggest that you're not happy? I'm like, because I'm not. Like, he's a friend of mine. Yeah, and I
Mhm.
lost a few friends
Mhm.
too, because they're like, oh, I never saw that picture before. Like, and some of the comments that I had to delete was like, oh, like this would have been a perfect opportunity for you to punch him. I'm like I'm just gonna delete that comment. I don't really like police
Mhm.
my own social media, even because I think social media should be a free speech space. But my social media is my social media, and so like some of the comments that my colleagues even made were like very uncomfortable, and it just, I guess, to bring it back full circle, I wonder like why why would someone be afraid of someone who thinks differently? And I wonder if it's because, is it because they don't believe in what they're saying themselves, and so they need others to believe it, and they need to shut people up who don't believe the same things that they believe in order for them to continue believing what they believe. I think the true sign of intellectual and emotional strength is to be willingly able to surround yourself with dissent without feeling threatened and intimidated.
Mm. And that's the strength and that restraint that you were describing before of keeping that middle ground perspective that makes it so challenging. I mean, the way that I heard your story, particularly in those two classes, was that you were living out the spirit of your relationship with him, and that you were modeling that for your students, even and especially when it hurt.
Yeah.
And that is really, fundamentally not maybe the task, but a important task of being able to help people widen their perspectives, is to allow them the opportunity to, in my view, to speak them out and to have that internal negotiation. I've often found sometimes people say something, but it's like almost like they're getting the emotion off their chest as opposed to the actual beliefs that are underneath it.
Yeah.
That's always been my speculation, particularly as a clinician, when somebody says something to me one week and then the next week maybe they have a full reversal. I thought about what I said, and you know what? That wasn't exactly where I was coming from, but in that moment it felt right. And that's what was coming out. Sometimes you do have to speak it. It was something that we at CTA, we kind of we didn't have a consensus in terms of at the time after Charlie's passing, and I'm very sorry for your loss. We we didn't have a consensus amongst us. What was happening at the time was people were reacting online, and of course, we have a social media presence to some degree, and an online presence, and so we were really trying to talk as an organization. How do we want to approach this moment? And on the early days, I think it was not a full yes to responding, so it was kind of a full no. Was kind of the way that we responded to things. We wanted to see things unfold, and something that really was a conscious recognition that we had was this was the loss of a human being.
Yeah.
This is not somebody who is a series of clips that you can, you know, discretionarily choose which clips you agree with and which clips you don't, which is what I think I saw in the coming days and weeks after. This is a full human being. He had a full, range of experiences and thoughts. And what I think really stands out about that is you guys would talk about the things you disagree with. That's the good stuff.
Yeah.
That's really where you can find out what you're about and what the other person's about. You can agree about, whatever you want to agree about, but when you can actually hold space with somebody, it can be transformative.
Yeah. Yeah. And as he's a full human being. He was a
Mhm.
quarterback back in high school too. So we talked a lot about
No kidding. Mhm.
sports. So, and the sports world was very much impacted because I don't think I'm allowed to share names necessarily, but a lot of athletes that I still am in communication with were very close with Charlie. And not even because of
Mm.
political reasons necessarily, but because of just like random conversational reasons. Celebrities tend to really hang out with other celebrities and they're able to understand one another. So the sports world, particularly football, which is what I'm familiar with, the football world was
Mm.
impacted, with Charlie Kirk's passing because I can tell you so many football players in the NFL right now were fairly close, much closer than even myself with Charlie Kirk.
It seems like there's a lot we can take away from the time period, both with him here and after his
Yeah,
passing. It seems like there's a lot that people can learn, particularly in the digital age, the social media age. I think about that a lot. And I know you've started to step in to write a bit about AI and things related to technology. And perhaps that's a good place to kind of to transition to
yeah,
next. But it is so easy to get lost in these surreal, unreal spaces online, these simulations of just like a checkered constellation of somebody. It's not even all the pieces in the
yeah,
box. It's just like here's what you have to work with. And also, by the way, here's what you're inadvertently choosing to
yeah.
work with. Because you're not selecting and electing to look for something different.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly does. I mean, in the world of AI, you don't know what's real anymore. The Sora videos,
Mm.
the Hey Gen, the Synthesia videos, the Nano Banana pictures that were posted just a couple of days ago, where you just cannot differentiate reality from virtual reality, essentially. There are also apps like Cluely, for example, where even when you're talking to someone, you might not know like, you might not be talking to them specifically because, like, in an interview process, like you'll have Cluely as an app listening to what questions are being asked, and it'll show you how you should answer based on your resume, based on what the expectations are. So
Mm.
we are we are making human behavior artificial. Rather than making artificial intelligence more human, we are making human intelligence more artificial. So I've written about that, and I worry because it's, where does humanity end? And the fact that we even call it artificial intelligence, what about it makes it so artificial? Is it just because it's not human nature, but rather man made or human made? And AI also has an opportunity to just replace humans in so many kinds of ways. I'm currently working on an article about dating AI. AI as romantic partners. It's an autoethnography from 2022
Mm.
23, which I have to put some revisions in. But there's some popular press pieces that I've written about AI romance as well. And it is true that if you want a romantic partner who never disagrees with you or disagrees with you only 10% of the time, you can set that in the settings. And so in your phone, you can have a relationship with someone or something, artificial intelligence, at the expense of a human connection. And now there's points and counterpoints to this as well. Some of the points that are dangerous is that, well, like we're already struggling with declining birth rates. South Korea is at zero point 0.6, the United States is 1.6, replacement levels are 2.1, and so we're already losing more people than we're bringing in. So AI is only going to make that worse, because what guy or girl is going to approach another girl or guy and with the possibility of being rejected when AI would never reject you. So every
Mm.
emotional need, every emotional need can be met through AI that you could want to meet through a human romantic partner. Now, can you have sex with AI? No, but that's also a not yet thing, right? There's technology
Right.
in the works for.
Hmm.
So yeah, you cannot yet have a physical relationship with AI. But if all that's left is a physical relationship with AI, stopping us from going fully into AI and being in romantic relationships with AI, then that is, if we're looking at 2027, 2028 being the cliff of birth rates. Because if these robots, these
Mm.
humanoid beings are created, and you can have a physical relationship with them. We already have about 5 years of history showing that people actually prefer to have relationships, whether it's in addition to human relationships or in place of human romantic partners. We've already seen that happen. I mean, it's turning into a pretty big market, whether it's Grok, whether it's Replica, whether it's character AI. And so I wonder about, like, at what point is human nature replaced? Now, while that might be the point, the counterpoint could be this, is that, are we the best partners we could be to our partners? If I have to compete against artificial intelligence for the adoration of my girlfriend, then does that make for a capitalist market where I have to be better? Where I say to myself, today I need to be a better boyfriend than I would have had AI not existed. Would that not then make me a better boyfriend? Maybe. I don't know the answers to these questions, but I think ultimately
Hmm.
it's not
Hmm.
having the questions to ask.
Question becomes, what is better? I think for human relationships, there is a certain level of conflict that's required in order to have kind of, well, one, just to kind of to establish where you stand at any given moment in time, but also the opportunity to see if you can come to a compromise, to see if you can come to a joint sense of agreement about how things might proceed moving forward, or in some cases, if it's not compatible, to move on. But the way you described it in this this entity that you can actually create and adjust in advance, it's completely customizable partner. It's like, is that actually what people desire? And I think some people, yes, I think we're starting to see that. And I'm curious about the autoethnographic element of your work here as well. the fact that we're seeing this rise in propensity for some people to be enticed by that relationship as opposed to practicing just being human, and experiencing the mess of a human relationship, the fact that it's so enticing, it caught up with me, the idea that my sociology courses, we used to talk about cultural lag, and that there was a hang time in between when something's an idea or a theory to when it's actually able to be designed or created and then also adopted by the greater culture. There's a time in between. But I've gotten the sense, and I wonder what you think about this, that time is closing in, that the distance between idea to actual design might be shortening or shrinking in some ways. And I wonder about our ability to adapt to that, both on an individual level, but just societally. I get this sense, and I don't know if you've had the same sense as well.
I'm reminded of Moore's law and just like how quickly things are advancing, and whether or not we can keep pace with it. And I think the answer is no, because policy, particularly restricting the use of AI, hasn't caught up, because any policy that's created today will probably take about 3 or 4 months to go into effect. And in 3 or 4 months, there will be a new version of Grok. There will be a new version of ChatGPT. And so we're trying to hit a moving target that is moving so quickly that there's no point almost. And so what happens, because AI is moving so fast, that any policy, it'll outrun any policy. Even AI detection software, data shows that AI detection software is so unreliable that many universities aren't even allowed to use AI detection software to catch their students, which by in and of itself is ironic, isn't it? You want to catch AI, you want to catch your students using AI by using AI? Like, look in the
Mm.
mirror, you know? So it's, and just like anytime I see an M dash in any student paper, I'm like, oh, is this AI? And then what if it's a student that just likes using M dashes? Like, are we not allowed?
Is that the longer
Yeah,
dash in this that chat
yeah.
GPT? Yeah.
And there are people
Mm-hmm.
that use M dashes because it's a quick little,
Mm.
but here's like, little like, transition punctuation. But like, we're penalizing good writing. If a student submits a work that has advanced writing in it, no longer am I impressed. Rather, I'm like, who wrote this? Did you write this? Did
Mm-hmm.
AI write this? But while that might be the point, here's a counterpoint to consider. As I mentioned, English is my fourth language. And so, because of dialect coaching and things like that, it sounds like I am an English native. At least I hope that's what it sounds like. I don't have much of an accent,
Mm-hmm.
but that's only because of the dialect coaching that I got when I was a kid. But many ideas that I want to express, they go through Bengali, they go through Arabic, they go through Hindi before reaching English. So it shows up sometimes in my writing. Sometimes I'll make some silly
Mm-hmm.
grammatical errors, and you're like, dude is a professor? Like, I don't understand, you know? So there are brilliant people who do not speak English, who do not speak Russian, who do not speak Chinese, who do not speak one of the top four, do not speak French, who do not speak one of the top four languages recognized in the world. So AI allows advanced thinkers to communicate in advanced language. And so if advanced language is not available to them through the use of AI, then advanced thinkers are essentially thought of as morons. And I think we need to pick a lane. As a society, as a community, maybe even as a species, we need to pick a lane. Either we lean into AI and say, you use it for whatever, whenever, because we wouldn't even be able to verify if these are your ideas, but we want to know about these ideas, whether it's from you, whether it's AI generated, whether it's 50-50, whether it's 40-60. We want the best ideas, whether it's from Michael, whether it's from Nafees, or whether it's from Grok, whether it's from ChatGPT. We either pick that lane or we shut it down completely and say no use of AI at all, which means the prerequisite to be considered intelligent would actually be you cannot speak any language besides English, Russian, Chinese, or French and Spanish. Now, that is very limiting. There are plenty of
Mhm.
intelligent people, plenty of brilliant geniuses who do not speak those languages. And if we were to shut down the use of AI, then we shut down some of the best human thinkers that we have. So what's it going to be? Is it going to be everything that's detected by AI is thought to be not original content? Or do we say we just want it's a marketplace of ideas? And if it's half human, half AI, then so be it. If it's the best idea, it's the best idea.
Do we lean into the skid a little bit here and continue to advance? Because in some sense, the idea of policy around it being as slow to keep up with it as it is, both in terms of awareness and maybe recognition has improved over the last couple of years. I would hazard a guess that it has, but I don't know. Even with that, it seems that the rate of innovation to counteract AI with AI or to counterbalance it still remains a possibility for us. But when you were describing it, I couldn't help but think of, is this a Tower of Babel situation where we've just had a Gutenberg press revolution where we suddenly can disseminate ideas like you're describing here through communication. There's a net there seems like there's a net potential positive there, not necessarily in the entirety, but that there are some potential positives there. Or is this are we flying a little too close to the sun? Sorry for the metaphors here, but I don't. It seems like we don't know, and it feels like people are trying to wrestle with it, but that life continues in the backdrop, and there isn't really a lot of time to fully invest yourself to find
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, there definitely isn't. And if America were to shut down AI progress, China wouldn't, Russia wouldn't, India.
Mm,
And so this is an arms race. And so we can't just say, well, let's just shut it down for our own safety. Like 21 days, shut it down. That's not going to work because those 21 days, China will
mm,
look at it and say, these are the 21 days that we need to do the most, because 21 days would be an eternity in technology, especially right now. So I don't think there's a chance that we hit the pause button. If anything, I think we hit the fast forward button. Because in order to stay competitive, uh, we might be extincting ourselves.
Out of curiosity, and I recognize we're kind of running up against time here. And thank
Yeah.
you so much for your time
No,
today. I really appreciate it. I
yeah.
was so looking forward to this conversation, and I'm so happy we got to have it. Just kind of bleeding the two worlds together. Have you seen any indication that you're starting to see AI show up in the social work field?
Yeah. I think Talkspace and BetterHelp, the creation of digital avatars. So HeyGen and Synthesia are programs that you can use to create digital avatars of yourself. And then you can type out any script and make it seem as though your digital avatar is saying those things. There's still a little bit of uncanny valley there. If you look closely enough, you'll be like, something seems
Mm,
off. And that something seems off, that 2 to 5% will give you the indication that it is AI generated. But that 2 to 5% will
mm,
be addressed in the next 2 or 3 years easily. And so the way that I see this happening is that, if you can upload the DSM into Talkspace or BetterHelp and just use name, image, likeness and give people a little bit of money to use their voices, their mannerisms
mm,
and things like that, you could essentially automate the teletherapy process for the most part. And so what does that do for social work jobs? What does
mm,
that do for psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapist jobs? I don't know. And that's what I mean when I say, like,
mm,
like you said, flying too close to the sun? And in the interest of competitive innovation, are we extincting ourselves, not through some sort of fire or earthquake or tsunami, but from a lack of ability to survive because we've invented our way out of having jobs, out of having food on our plates, out of having roofs over our head. And so, could we be the first species in recorded history to innovate our way into extinction? I think it's a good possibility of that happening, unfortunately.
mm, Well, I sure hope it
Yeah,
doesn't go
me
that
too.
direction. In the meantime, all we can do is keep a watchful eye and try and keep up to date with
Yeah,
what's happening.
yeah.
Absolutely. Dr. Nafees Alam, thank you so much for joining us again today. And where can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
They could find, well, just Google me, I suppose. I'm all over the place. I don't have any specific
Okay.
state or anything
Okay.
like that, but yeah, just Google me, reach
Mhm.
out to me, and I guess follow me on social media, Instagram. I forget what my title is even, but it's I'm not hard to find. My parents blessed me with a very unique name, so it'll be easy to track me
Mm.
down. But I do look forward to having conversations in the future as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Likewise. Absolutely. It's my absolute pleasure.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.